Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to talk about why I restarted my indie factory game from scratch, and also talk about how things are going so far. Now at first this may sound like a stupid decision, but I was totally aware of what I was doing and why I was doing it, and things are actually looking really good for the reboot of the project since I've gotten tons done. For the majority of the people who are new here, I'm making a game called Galactory, and it's a factory building game where you travel between different planets and dimensions to expand your factory and upgrade your exploration tools to venture further out into the cosmos, unlocking new elements, doing quests for alien civilizations, and much more. What I just described is where I'm trying to take the project, but it's been about a year since I started work on the original project and I'd done barely anything. Although, I was fully aware of why development was so unbelievably slow, and I really wanted to stick with the project because I enjoyed development on it and I really liked the premise. There were two main reasons that caused me to restart the project, on top of all the other little things, and the two reasons were lack of optimization early on and awful game framework and infrastructure. If this isn't already too obvious for a factory game, the scale of your factory gets really big really quickly, meaning after only a short amount of playtime, there could be 50,000 or more conveyors and other buildings spanning your whole factory. And for my previous project, this problem of bad optimization is what I kept running into. I rewrote my conveyor script a grand total of 3 times, and after all of that it was still really slow and really buggy too. That's a small peek into the part optimizing played in my loss of motivation. Now I want to go a little bit into the game framework side of me restarting, because it got really bad. To put it simply, I had no idea what I was doing when I started Galactory, as I didn't know how large the scale of the project was going to be since it was originally intended to just be a small factory game, so all the infrastructure was terrible from the beginning of development. Every script needed to be rewritten and added to as the game grew and changed, and sure, even with good framework, some scripts need to be modified every now and then, but every new building I made, every little change I made, a bunch of new code needed to be written to fix bugs that popped up in order for things to work. I did discover a fix for this bad infrastructure down the line, but by that point it was too late, and if I wanted to go through with that change, I would need to rewrite every single script in the game to fix it, so it was off the table. This spiraling problem of bad, unsustainable code made it almost impossible to work on the game and actually enjoy my time with it. So, in about November of 2024, I began my long break from the development of Galactory, which lasted about 5 months. Every month that passed, my motivation to actually continue the project and keep working on it became less and less, to the point where I decided the project was dead and I wouldn't continue working on it. Then one night, and it always happens in the shower, like I cannot stress it enough, I get a huge idea buff while I'm in the shower, and it's too OP. Developers of real life, please nerf the shower buff, please! Anyway, all jokes aside, one night I had an idea to write conveyors in a way I had never thought of before, and very quickly, every day, I became more and more excited to begin a project where I made as performant conveyors as I possibly could, unknowing that it would eventually turn into me remaking Galactory from scratch. So about 3 weeks ago, probably about a month or even longer after this video was edited and uploaded, I started a new project, which I named Conveyor Testing, where I would try to make conveyors as performant as I possibly could. The idea I had for the conveyors was actually super simple, so I'll explain it here. Basically, every conveyor will have a certain number of nodes on it, which items will get moved to and from. Every conveyor has 5 nodes on it, and instead of items moving smoothly along the conveyors using weird math and item collisions, they would teleport between the nodes, and then later on in development, I'd planned to make them move more smoothly by just basically in post making them move. This also removes the need for items doing collision checks, as they could instead just check if the node had an item at it, which was also much more performant in the long run. So, I spent about a day turning that thought into reality, but for me to use the conveyors and properly test them, I was going to need a building system, an inventory system, and producers so I could actually see some items on the belts. And this is where I realized I should just remake Galactory from the beginning, since I was already considering it to begin with. And that's when I actually began working on the project as if it were Galactory instead of just a test to make performant conveyors, so I started adding feature after feature. Before I actually finished making the conveyors, I made a very basic build system so I could actually play stuff around and test things, and I could actually watch my factory do stuff now. The next thing I did was added a saving and loading system, and getting that out of the way early so it's usable as I add things to the game is going to be super useful, so I don't have to grind out saving things on one day or like over a week. And I also made the save and load system a bunch more friendly for me to use compared to what I had in the original project. After adding saving and loading, I made a menu management script that made adding new menus to the game super simple for me, as in a big project, menu management is super important and can get out of hand very quickly and easily, so getting this one done early too was super important. And the next thing, which I at first thought would be very daunting, was actually incredibly easy to set up and get working. In projects where there is tons of objects needing to be spawned in, there's this super useful concept or thing referred to as object pooling, where basically, instead of spawning objects in when they're needed and destroying them when they aren't needed anymore, they are spawned in bulk when the scene starts and made inactive, and then whenever they're needed, they are just activated, teleported to where they need to be, and then configured for how they need to be used. For example, their sprite is changed. And then, when they aren't needed anymore, they return back into the pool to be recycled again for future use. In Unity, instantiating and destroying game objects is really unperformant, so swapping to a pooling system is a huge performance increase and will certainly go a long way for the project. Now at this point, I hadn't really done a real stress test yet, and running stress tests was super annoying for me at this point, since if I wanted to run a test on literally any large scale, I had to manually place every single conveyor, which was super slow and jank. So the next thing I did was adding a rectangle build tool, which allowed me to place huge arrays of conveyors to stress test them. And the big question for me, and maybe you, was, how performant were the conveyors really? Super performant actually. I'm going to give you some benchmarking results, so whenever I give FPS values, keep in mind they exclude rendering, meaning I'm giving raw numbers in terms of how efficient the code is, since I haven't optimized any sort of rendering yet, but I'll give some benchmarks here. These tests were all done in a build and with every conveyor consistently pushing items, meaning that the conveyors were not empty and just sitting there. So, for the 20,000 conveyor benchmark, before placing them I had 2,800 FPS, and after placing them I had 2,400 FPS. For the 50,000 conveyor benchmark, before I placed them 2,800 FPS once again, and after I placed them I had 2,136 FPS. And finally, for the 100,000 conveyor benchmark, before placing them I had 2,800 FPS once again, and after placing them I had about 1,300 FPS. And after doing those benchmarks, I actually decided to make conveyors smoothly move items instead of just teleporting them. It only animates things on screen, so here's some footage of what's going on behind the scenes. Basically, whatever is on screen will animate fully, but anything off screen won't animate at all, so the player will never notice anything isn't animated. Now that I had conveyors and some good frameworks in place, it was time to start making a few buildings to mess around with. The first building I decided to make was a crafter. You give it a recipe, and then by using conveyors you pump items into the crafter, and when it finishes crafting, it spits out the result. The day after making the crafter, I made a furnace, which takes in a fuel and a raw material that can be smelted and spits out a cooked material. And while making this, I thought, hey, hold on, why don't I make this furnace have an output slot so we can build up a backlog of items? And that's when the project turned towards a much better direction. Previously, the inventory system just held items, so there was no sort of inventory management at all. You basically just have items in your inventory and can't interact with them in any way at all. So, to make the output slot actually useful, I wanted the player to be able to interact with these slots and directly move items between the slots. And an example of this is Minecraft. This new slot-based inventory system opened up a ton of doors, with the main one being that you could interact and manually use the buildings, like manually using the furnace or crafter rather than having to use the conveyors and other buildings to make them work. Although, now with the slot-based inventory, I needed a way for you to view the description and name of the item you were hovering over, so I added a little hover element to items to show that. And making the slot-based inventory and the hover element triggered something inside of me to really want to make a storage building. So, that's what I did. I made a storage building, which as you'd expect, you can push items into it or manually place items in it to store stuff away. And on the day of writing my script, I added a little trash slot to the inventory, which currently has two settings. The first setting is items go on a 2-second timer after being placed in the slot, and they get destroyed once it reaches 0. The other setting is items stay in the slot until you add another item to the slot, where the items that were originally in the trash slot get destroyed. Let me know what setting you might prefer in the comments. Next video, I'm going to be focusing on the magic/sciencey side of the game, since it is about discovering new elements and traveling to alien planets and other dimensions and whatever. So if you have any suggestions for any magic or science machinery, please let me know in the comments. And yeah, that's pretty much what progress I've made since starting again from scratch, and to be honest, I've gotten the game back to where it was in an even better state in only 3 weeks, so I'm super excited to see what the future holds for this project. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to my channel to see where I take the project next, and like this video too, as it means the world to me. And I've got nothing much to say now except thank you for watching and see you next time.